In December of 2025, a judge in Massachusetts looked at Brian Walshe and chose two words to describe what he had done: barbaric and incomprehensible. Then he sentenced him to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Brian Walshe had murdered his wife, Anna, a 39-year-old mother of 3 young boys, on New Year's Day, almost 3 years earlier. He had dismembered her body, and he had scattered her remains so thoroughly across so many dumpsters that to this day she has never been found. There would be no grave for her 3 sons to visit. The case that convicted him did not have a body. It had something almost stranger, and in the end more damning: a digital trail left by a man who apparently believed that the internet was a private place to plan a murder. This is the story of how a husband killed his wife on the first morning of the year, told everyone she had simply gone on a business trip, and was undone not by a witness, not by a confession, but by his own search history. To understand it, we have to go back to a New Year's Eve dinner in Cohasset, Massachusetts, because on the surface, the last normal night of Anna Walshe's life looked like the picture of an ordinary couple ringing in the new year. Anna Walshe was 39 years old, and by every outward measure she had built an impressive life. She was a successful real estate executive, splitting her time between the family's home in the quiet coastal town of Cohasset, Massachusetts, and her work in Washington, D.C. She was the mother of 3 little boys. She was, to the people who knew her, vibrant and warm and full of plans. She had come to the United States and built a career through sheer drive, the kind of person who always seemed to be moving towards something. To know her, by the accounts of those who did, was to be a little swept up in her energy, and that is part of what makes this so hard to sit with. Anna was not a woman who faded out of a room. She was a woman a room noticed. For someone like that to simply vanish on a quiet holiday morning, and for the world to take days to even ask where she was, tells you everything about how carefully her absence had been disguised. And she was married to Brian Walshe, a man whose own life, beneath the surface of their comfortable home, was a great deal more complicated than it appeared. Brian Walshe was not, in that winter, a free man in the fullest sense. He was awaiting sentencing in a federal fraud case, living under the kind of legal cloud that follows a person from room to room. It is worth understanding that pressure, because pressure is the soil these crimes grow in. A man facing the collapse of his own freedom, the loss of his reputation, the unraveling of the comfortable life he had built. That is a man with a great deal to lose, and a great deal of resentment looking for somewhere to land. None of that excuses anything, but it helps explain the cold, deliberate quality of what came next. Because what happened in that house on New Year's Day was not the work of a single furious moment. It had the shape of something a cornered man had been turning over in his mind. The marriage, by various accounts, carried its own strains, but to the outside world, and to a family friend who joined them for dinner on the last night of the year, the Walshes were simply a couple at home for the holidays, in a nice house, in a nice town, where the worst thing that was supposed to happen was a hangover on the 1st of January. That is the thing about so many of these stories. The horror does not announce itself. It hides inside the ordinary, and it waits for the house to empty and the witnesses to go home. On the evening of the 31st of December, 2022, the Walshes hosted a small New Year's Eve dinner. A friend came over. They ate. The year turned. And at some point in the early hours of the 1st of January, that friend went home, and Anna Walshe was, as far as the world knew, alive and well in her own house with her husband and her children. She would never be seen again. We do not know exactly what happened inside that home in the hours after midnight, because the one person who survived it has never truthfully said. But we know something far more chilling than a confession, because at 4:52 in the morning on the 1st of January, in the dark, quiet hours of New Year's Day, someone began using Brian Walshe's devices to search the internet. And the things they searched for are the things no innocent person ever needs to know: how to dispose of a body, how to dismember a body, how to clean up blood, not once, not in a single panicked moment, but across a series of searches that read like a grim, methodical to-do list. While most of the world was asleep after the celebrations, while 3 little boys slept in their beds, someone in that house was quietly asking a search engine how to make a human being disappear. Think about the timing of those searches one more time, because it is the heart of this entire case. 4:52 in the morning. Not days later, when a guilty man might panic, not after a body had to be hidden in a hurry. In the small hours of the very first day of the year, before the sun was up, before the children were awake, that is when someone in that house sat down and began researching how to take a person apart and erase them. There is no innocent version of those searches. There is no accident that produces that list. They are the closest thing this case has to a confession, typed out in the dark. And then, when the morning came, Brian Walshe had a story ready. Anna, he said, had left for a business trip. She had gone to Washington, D.C. for work. There was nothing to worry about. She would be back. If the idea of those searches in the dark of New Year's morning is sitting cold in your chest, a quick like helps this story reach more people. And stay with me, because the lie about the business trip is exactly the thread that began to unravel everything. For a few days, the lie held, because it was a clever one. Anna Walshe traveled for work all the time. A trip to D.C. was not strange, it was normal. And so, in the immediate aftermath, no alarm bells rang, not at home, where her husband acted as though everything was fine, and not in the wider world, which had no reason to think a busy executive's travel was anything but routine. That is the cruelty of choosing a victim with a life like Anna's. A woman who traveled constantly was a woman whose absence could be explained away for days. A stay-at-home spouse missing for 72 hours sets off alarms within hours. A globe-trotting executive missing for 72 hours is, at first, just a busy week. Brian Walshe understood that, whether he ever put it into words or not, and the story he told leaned on it perfectly. He did not need the lie to last forever. He only needed it to last long enough. But a lie like that has a built-in expiration date, because the place she supposedly went was full of people expecting her. On the 4th of January, 3 days after she vanished, it was not her husband who raised the alarm. It was her coworkers in Washington who realized that Anna had never arrived, never checked in, never shown up for the work she had supposedly traveled all that way to do. They reported her missing. And once the question was asked out loud, "Where is Anna Walshe?" the husband's story began to come apart almost immediately. On the 5th of January, police in Cohasset opened a search and asked the public for help. On the 6th, investigators confirmed the detail that turned a missing persons case into something far darker. Anna Walshe had never boarded any flight to Washington. The business trip had never happened. She had not left Cohasset at all, which meant that whatever had become of her, it had become of her in that house, on that night, and the only adult who had been there with her was the man who kept insisting she had simply gone away. And it was around this point that investigators stopped looking for a missing woman and started looking at her husband and at the devices in that house. Because while Brian Walshe was telling the world a story about a business trip, the machines in his own home had been quietly keeping a record of the truth. Take 1 second to subscribe before this next part, because what investigators found on those devices, and what Brian Walshe himself eventually admitted, is where this case stops being a disappearance and becomes one of the most disturbing murders in recent memory. On the 8th of January, Brian Walshe was arrested, at first not for murder, but for obstruction, for misleading the very investigation into his missing wife. But the case against him was already growing into something else entirely, and at the center of it was that digital trail. Investigators recovered the searches that had begun at 4:52 on New Year's morning, the queries about dismembering a body, disposing of a body, cleaning blood. And the more they pulled at the thread, the worse it got. There was evidence that he had gone out and purchased cleaning supplies. There were items stained with his wife's blood. And there was the terrible, concrete picture the prosecution would build of what he had actually done. That Brian Walshe killed Anna on New Year's Day, that he dismembered her body, and that he disposed of her remains by scattering them in dumpsters across the region, including, investigators said, at a location near his own mother's home. Picture the logistics of that, because the prosecution had to. A man does not scatter a body across a region by accident. It takes planning and driving and the cold nerve to do it out in the open, bag by bag, bin by bin, over hours. He used the ordinary machinery of everyday life, dumpsters, trash routes, the things a community throws away without a second glance, to make the woman he had married disappear into the waste stream of an entire region. It is one of the most disturbing details of the case precisely because it is so utterly banal. And notice who it was that finally sounded the alarm. It was not her husband, sleeping under the same roof, who reported her missing. It was her co-workers in Washington, days later, who noticed she had never arrived and never called. By the time the police in Cohasset began searching and asking the public for help, the trail was already cold, by design. When officers did close in, the first charge they could make stick was not murder at all. It was misleading an investigation, the lie itself, caught before the killing could be proven. The truth took longer, but it came. He did not just kill his wife. He took her apart, and he distributed the pieces of her so widely that the people searching for her would never be able to gather her back together. And here is the detail that removes any lingering doubt. Before his trial even began, Brian Walshe pleaded guilty to dismembering his wife and to lying to the police about it. He admitted in a court of law that he had taken Anna's body apart and that he had built a wall of lies around it. The only question he left for the jury was the one he would not concede, whether he was the one who had killed her in the first place. And that is a remarkable place for a man to stand, to admit, under oath, that you dismembered your wife and lied about it to police, and then to ask 12 strangers to believe that someone else did the actual killing, and that you only handled the aftermath. It is a defense built on the slimmest margin imaginable, and it asks a jury to accept a version of events in which a man takes his wife's body apart and scatters it across a region, but is somehow not the person who ended her life. The jury would not have to think very hard about that one. That question went to trial in late 2025, nearly 3 years after Anna vanished. And it was, in its way, a remarkable case, because prosecutors had to prove a murder without the one piece of evidence that murder trials are usually built around: a body. There was no Anna to autopsy, no remains to examine, because the man on trial had already made sure of that. But what the prosecution had instead was almost impossible to argue with. They had the searches, beginning in the dark hours of the very morning she disappeared. They had the blood. They had the cleaning supplies. They had his lies about the business trip, exposed one by one, and they had his own guilty plea to dismembering her and lying to police. The jury did not need a body to see the shape of what had happened. There was a time when a case like this would have been considered nearly unwinnable. The old assumption was that you could not convict a person of murder without a victim to point to. But Anna Walshe's case is part of a quiet shift in how these crimes are prosecuted. A recognition that a determined killer who destroys a body has not destroyed the case, only changed its shape. The digital record, the forensic traces, the lies caught and timed and laid side by side, together they can speak as loudly as any autopsy. Brian Walshe gambled that no body would mean no conviction. He was wrong. After deliberating for roughly 6 hours over 2 days, they returned. They found Brian Walshe guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of misleading the investigation, guilty of the improper handling of his wife's remains. And in December of 2025, the judge handed down the sentence: life in a Massachusetts prison with no possibility of parole, with additional years stacked on top for the other crimes. Before he passed that sentence, The judge reached for words to describe what Brian Walshe had done to Anna and to their 3 sons, and he settled on 2 of them: barbaric and incomprehensible. What lingers about Anna Walshe's case is the silence at the center of it. The silence where she should be. Because of what her husband did, there is no resting place for her. There is no grave for her 3 boys to stand beside, no spot on the earth where they can go to be near their mother. He did not only take her life, he took the very thing that lets a family grieve. 3 little boys lost their mother on a holiday morning, and then lost, on top of it, the simple human comfort of a place to mourn her. They will grow up knowing what happened to her, in detail far too vivid for any child to carry, and without the one mercy that even most grieving families are given. There is no headstone with her name on it. There is only the region she was scattered across, and the silence where she used to be. And yet, in the end, he could not take the truth. Because he made a mistake that feels almost unbelievable for a man capable of such cold calculation, he assumed that the searches he typed in the dark of New Year's morning would stay secret. They did not. The same technology that fills our lives with convenience also keeps a quiet, relentless record of us, and in this case that record spoke for a woman who could no longer speak for herself. There is something almost fitting in that. A man who tried so hard to erase his wife was convicted by the one witness he could not silence, his own hands on a keyboard at 4:52 in the morning, asking how to make her disappear. She came to this country and built something out of little more than her own determination. She raised 3 sons. She was loved, and she was erased by the one person who had promised, at the very start of it all, to spend his life protecting her. That is the betrayal at the center of nearly every story like this one, that the danger was never a stranger at the door. It was already inside, sitting across the dinner table, on the last ordinary night of her life. Anna Walshe was a mother of 3 who deserved to watch her boys grow up. She should be here. So I'll leave it with you. Brian Walshe killed his wife, dismembered her, scattered her so completely that she has never been found, and was convicted without a body on the strength of his own search history. Do you think a sentence of life without parole is enough for a man who denied his children even a place to grieve? Tell me in the comments, and tell me whose case I should look into next, because there are too many of these stories that deserve to be told carefully. If Anna's story stayed with you, take a second to subscribe, because there is always another one that needs telling. And if you, or someone you love, is afraid in their own home, please reach out. In the United States, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. Thank you for staying with me to the end.